Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Better Place, Talking International Law with me, Jonathan Coleb. Welcome back. We hope you're all safe and well, wherever you are tuning in from around the globe. Today, I am so thrilled to have a dear friend, Jeyashree Nadarajah. Am I allowed to call you just Shree from now on?
Shree, please. Yes.
Shree.
Yeah.
Jeyashree Nadarajah. She's got a one of the biggest hearts I've ever met, and she has channeled that into a career focused on protecting the most vulnerable, women and children in situations of armed conflict. Thank you for joining us today, Shree.
Thank you, Johnny, for reaching out to me and thinking about me and considering me for this wonderful initiative of yours. Like you said, we've known each other for a very long time. So
yeah, let's not count the years.
Yeah, that's right. And so I'm really honored to be here and happy to contribute.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you. Again, technology is amazing. Shree's sitting in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia at the moment. I'm in Melbourne, Australia. It's amazing that we get to connect like this. So thank you to technology and to Zoom. Let me share a little bit of your formal bio, Shree, so people can get a sense of who you are, and then we can spend some time sort of unpacking it. Jeyashree Nadarajah, Shree, has had an incredible career in the realm of, in my words, the civilian protection of armed conflict. Shree has worked for various UN agencies and offices, including the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, the Office of the UN Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict, for the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, and for the UN Development Programme, the UNDP. In those roles, she's worked on protecting women and children and civilians more generally in conflict-affected areas around the globe. She has done so in New York, in UN HQ, but she has also done so in the field as well. Most recently, I think, helping or leading the effort to reintegrate children on the Filipino island of Mindanao after the Bangsomoro Peace Accords were signed. Jeyashree has undergraduate degrees from, I didn't know this, from Middlesex University in the United Kingdom, and an MBA from, is it Bremen University in Germany, and where I do know Shree from, and I can attest to this, she does have an MA in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, where she attended as a recipient of the Rotary World Peace Fellowship. It's a wonderful CV. Did I miss anything, Shree?
No, that's a lot already.
So, two follow-up questions. One, tell us something that isn't on your CV.
That isn't on my CV?
Yeah. Like, what are you proud of that you haven't put on the CV?
Well, I would say everything. I would say motherhood, right? So that trumps everything that I've done so far, I think. I think it's, to be honest, I think it's even more stressful than having to get an armed group to release children. So, yeah, but it's a wonderful experience, and it's a new experience for me, and I'm just happily doing motherhood at the moment. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yes, parenting is hard, and you are the mother of a 3-year-old as well. So
a 3-year-old, yes.
Yes, it's an interesting phase. Yeah.
Keeps you on your toes.
Yes, or exhausted and lying flat. on your back, either one. Well, fantastic. Oh, I'm so glad you you mentioned that. I think that's really important. Parenthood and motherhood, and maybe we can circle back to that as well later on. My other sort of follow-up question: what's your favorite ice cream flavor?
Oh, that's a good question. I love the raspberry ripple. Do you know that one?
So it's like vanilla, but it's got the
Yes.
raspberry through it. Okay, very
Yeah,
good.
that's right. Yeah.
All
Love
right.
it.
I love hearing other people's ice cream flavors. Fantastic.
What's yours?
No, I asked the questions.
Oh,
No, Shree, peppermint choc chip has to be my favorite ice cream flavor. Peppermint choc chip. That's okay. I can sense disdain. That's all right. That's fine. I'm comfortable. Shree, now, when I pitched you this conversation, I mentioned that this was for international law students of international law. You don't have a law degree,
I don't.
do you? So, does international law practitioner, is that a label that sits comfortably with you? As in, do you describe yourself in those terms?
Not really, to be honest. Although I know that in my work, I am guided by international law, and obviously a lot of the work that we do relates to accountability, right, and ending impunity for violations against women and children, and that's international law. So the work is guided by the law and also grounded in the law. So I guess, yeah, while I don't necessarily think of myself as an international law practitioner, but yeah, I think that's what we do, right?
Right. And do you, do you wish you had a law degree? Have there been moments
That's
over the years where it's like, oh, a law degree would have come in handy here, or not really?
No, that's actually a very good question, and in fact, I do wish I had a law degree. Many times throughout my career, when I would sit in meetings, particularly with diplomats, right, or government representatives, where I would think like, if I had an international law background, I could counter his arguments better. So yeah, certainly, I think having a law degree I think it comes in handy. I mean, in like, yeah, I'm speaking in very simplistic terms, but I think in a career like with the UN, a law degree goes a long way,
Right.
and gives you a lot of flexibility and room to maneuver in the system. So particularly if you want to pursue a career in the UN, I think it's an asset.
Okay. So let's get a little bit about your journey, Shree. When you were back in high school, back in the day, what did you want to do when you grew up?
I did not know is the honest answer, really. I was looking for direction, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, and which is why I did a degree in accounting and finance, just because. But I was really very actively involved in community service programs from a very young age, and that passion sort of drove me, right, and I knew that in the long term, that's what I wanted to do, something to do with bettering the lives of people on the ground, of societies, of individuals, wherever I can, and kind of take it to an international level. So it took me a while to sort of, make my way and find that path. But I'm glad I did eventually. Yeah.
And so can you remember, like, was there a moment that really sort of made this career happen for you? Like, was there a specific inflection point?
Yeah, if I look back, I remember, so I was working in the private sector, right, initially, and I was doing consulting, management consulting, whatever that is, right? And and you're smiling, yeah. So yeah, I can see your thought bubble there. And at one point, I just thought, like, what am I doing here, right? I wasn't getting any joy from it. I felt that we were not necessarily, I wouldn't say not being honest with our clients, right? But let's say we were stretching our arguments to fit the needs of the clients. And I realized that it wasn't making me happy and I needed to leave. So yeah, long story short, I resigned the same day. I applied to the UN, and I applied to another international humanitarian agency based in Malaysia called Mercy Malaysia. And I got called in for an interview by both organizations. And I chose the UN, even though it was actually a very low level starting position, but it was okay. It was an entry point for me. And then the rest is history, as they say.
So you gave up basically a larger salary, I presume, in management consulting. You actually took a position that maybe you might have thought was beneath you in some sense, as you say, an entry-level position, but that was your moment.
Yeah.
What was that? Do you remember the position? What was it?
Yeah, it was a business control assistant or something like that. Yeah. So I was, doing the budgets and the contracts and writing proposals, which was the interesting part of the job. But I was also taking on a lot of, the administrative type work. Yeah, but it was okay. It was, I don't advocate really sort of entering the UN and taking up any position just because you want to work for the UN. But I was also lucky that I was able to get the scholarship by virtue of having done some work with the UN, but also obviously with Jeyashree, right? And that kind of helped me transition from being a local employee to entering the international world.
Right. Okay. So, and I think we hear your son in the background. All good. No, it's all good. This is life. Fantastic. Okay, and so you have had an amazing career primarily in the UN system ever since. What career accomplishment are you most proud of?
I would say my 3 years in Mindanao, Philippines, was where I felt the most accomplished and most fulfilled.
That was after. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to make. So that was after 10 years being in UN headquarters, wasn't it? In New York. You went to the field. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go on.
Yes. So I mean, while I was in the headquarters, because we work in an office, a political office, or the SRSG is a high-level political advocate, right? And we provide technical support to our child protection advisors in the missions, so in peacekeeping missions. And so, I undertook a lot of field missions within that time, right, at headquarters. But as I said, the 3 years in Mindanao was the most fulfilled that I felt.
What did you do there?
Yeah.
What did you do there? And yeah, tell us a little bit about that and your reflections on it.
Right. So I was leading the engagement with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front on the recruitment and use of children. So they had recruited and used children in the conflict, or as we say, children are associated with this group, right? Because the children are not necessarily only child soldiers, but many of the children also provide supporting roles to the group. And the Moro Islamic Liberation Front signed an agreement with the UN in 2009. But obviously, because of the conflict that was ongoing in Mindanao, they could not implement that agreement. So there were a lot of starts and stops over the years. And once they signed the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsomoro, they also realized that it was time for them to be serious about actually implementing and complying with the agreement that they signed on children.
And you helped demobilize and reintegrate into their communities, I believe, around 2,000 children that were formerly associated with the MILF. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, so I wouldn't say reintegrate, because the kids, the context in Mindanao is slightly different in terms of, because the children are children of the adult combatants, right? So by virtue of that, they have become associated with the movement. And so it's not like the context in Africa where you see children being forcibly recruited or abducted from their homes and then taken away from their communities. And so then you have to reintegrate them and reunite them with their families. In this case, the children were already living within the communities and with their families. But we had to disassociate them or disengage them from the armed groups. So, which also meant that they were no longer performing any military type roles for the group. And so it was hard, as you can well imagine, right? Because when you walk into the community, which is also their military camps, in a way, you may see some children in uniforms or carrying weapons, but most of the children are in civilian clothes. So, it really took 3 years to slowly work on the commanders, particularly the local commanders, who knew who those children were, and to get them to identify these children and then to disengage them.
Yeah, and I know you've left that work a few years back, but I think you have recently done another consultancy that took you back there, or at least virtually took you back to Mindanao. How are things going now in the middle of 2020? Are you optimistic?
Well, the last time I spoke to former friends and colleagues who are still there, I think the situation, well, the COVID situation has affected them quite badly. And so for the humanitarian agencies, a lot of the work has been refocused, right, to COVID. But which is important. But since I left, you may have heard of the Marawi siege. Sorry, someone just crawled in front of the camera. The Marawi siege, and a lot of the more violent extremist armed groups are still present in the region, and many of them have children amongst them. So that is a difficult. It's a challenge, I think, more challenging than trying to get children from an armed group that has signed a peace agreement, as you know, and who wants
Right.
the international legitimacy and credibility, whereas these more violent extremist groups, you know, have a different agenda.
Right.
So yeah, so it's stabilized in the sense that there is now a Bangsomoro government, and they are taking responsibility for their citizens and for the issues in their, you know, within their autonomous region. But we haven't seen a stop in fighting necessarily, particularly in the island provinces. And still there are quite a number of human rights violations.
More work to be done.
A lot more, yeah.
Let me take you back though to Turtle Bay, to UN headquarters in New York. You spent a fair bit of time there. Well, if I recall correctly, you had an office on the 35th floor of that very famous Secretariat building. 31st, excuse me.
Yeah,
31st, I gave you a promotion.
Yes.
What are your memories working of that at that place?
Wow. You know, I think it's very fast moving, right? A fast paced environment. There's just lots of work, lots of important people, I guess, or people who perceive themselves to be important, if I can if I can say that. We may need to edit that out later, but anyway.
You didn't name names yet.
A lot of meetings, right? Because that's where all the planning takes place, right? A lot of churning out of reports, you know, but having said all of that, it's really for me, it was a very a space where I learned a lot, right? It's a steep learning curve. You're there, you have to go out and meet partner organizations. You have to go out and speak to member states who are, you know, who are representing parties to the conflict, really, because, you know, they may come from countries where their state security forces are the ones who are committing violations, right, of international law. And so we, you know, and I was primarily responsible for drafting the Secretary General's report for children in armed conflict, and later on sexual violence in conflict, that was deliberated by the Security Council. And as part of that process, once we have the draft text of all the violations taking place in that country situation, we have to sit down with their representative and share that information with them and allow them the opportunity to provide, you know, their own sort of rebuttal or any other statistics or data that they may feel is the more accurate information, or right.
And your draft may go through a few iterations based on those conversations before it's finally made public.
It would, yes, it would go through several more iterations, but we would not change the facts, because the information, you know, we may add information about the measures that the government has taken to address those concerns, but the information comes from a system that's implemented in the country, right? That's led by the UN in the country concerned. It's called the Monitoring and Reporting System. And all that information that's gathered by the UN and our partners in a country is verified information. And the UN stands by that information. And so by the time it comes to headquarters, it's, you know, it's solid information. And so with that information doesn't change. What changes is really the, you know, the opportunity for the country to give us any relevant text on measures that they took to address those concerns.
So you raised sort of the issue of politics and engaging country representatives on these reports. I mean, civil society every year, I know, sort of wait with bated breath for the official Children in Armed Conflict report, for example, and about who would be named, shamed, which countries or armed groups would be. And there have been some, I would say, well-founded accusations in the past that politics have gotten in the way, actually, of, you know, certain countries being named and shamed. One country, in particular, the word on the street was that they were threatening to withhold funds from the UN organization if they were named and shamed. Do you have? I don't. You know, you don't have to verify those reports or not. But do you have any sort of reflections on that?
Yes, I mean, yeah, I know which country you're referring to, and I've read the news, and I think if I remember correctly, that country was ultimately put on the list the following year, but the list has, after my time, I think the list has morphed into something slightly different, right?
Right. Yeah. Two annexes,
Okay.
not just one.
Yes.
That. Yeah.
I think there were 2 annexes before as well, but I think
Okay.
now it's also I think there's a column where it highlights the measures that these countries have taken, I think, right? And so I believe that country is off the list again this year.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, and
Yes.
I don't want to get you in delicate, you know, in hot water, but it is interesting anyway, the interplay between the politics and the facts.
Yeah.
And perhaps it's not, the accusation is not that there were facts that were misquoted or misconstrued in these reports, but that, you know, there were certain choices made about how facts are going to be represented, or just simply not represented and just omitted in the first place.
Yeah. So
and that interplay
it is
between, you know, that you were in the belly of the beast, I feel like, and that tension between politics and funding and country support for what you do, with some more pure, straightforward advocacy based on the facts. You were at that interface between the politics.
I was, and sometimes it was very frustrating. You know, and sometimes you can't, you're unable to sort of get what you want the first year, you know, despite having all that information. So it's also a step-by-step process, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the first year we might get to include 1 paragraph on that country in the report. And then, you know, that gets that country into the door in an SG's report to the council, which is what countries try to not get themselves into, right? Because once you feature in the SG's annual report, that means it's harder to get yourself out of it. So that's where the politics takes place before that even right happens, before the drafting of the report even happens. So getting into the report is already progress, right? Noting all that politics in the interplay that you mentioned. And then, you know, you take it step by step, and then finally you get the parties on the list. And sometimes if they get off the list, it doesn't mean that they're off the report. It doesn't mean that the monitoring and reporting stops as well.
Right. And we should say that this monitoring and reporting mechanism and all the structures around it, and including the reports, are actually predicated on a UN Security Council resolution. So a piece of international law that mandates your office to produce these reports and conduct this monitoring and reporting. So again, that programmatic, the really practical civilian protection work that you do is predicated on international law. Yeah, and it was the Security Council really that sort of articulated what violations of rights would be monitored and protected as well by the UN agency.
Exactly. So, you know, the Security Council had recognized the protection of children in armed conflict as a concern of international peace and security. And that's why they created this mandate and placed this issue on its agenda. And then subsequently, I mean, this was back in 1999. And so we're now 20 some years into it. So there are a lot of council resolutions on it. But every year, you know, we try to push the agenda, right, further and further so that we can better prevent these violations from taking place in the first instance, right, and not always respond to it.
Yeah.
And part of that is also making sure that our peacekeepers are trained to be able to recognize these violations when they take place, to be able to report on them and to respond appropriately. So peacekeeping has also evolved. Yeah.
That's been the basis of some of your more recent consulting work. Is that right?
So yeah, so what I do now is to train military who are deploying as peacekeepers to these missions. So I'm the civilian on the team. The rest of the guys are military guys, and because child protection and sexual violence in conflict is led by the civilian component in peacekeeping missions. And you know, so I'm there really to train the military on their roles and responsibilities and how they should collaborate and work with the civilian components, but also with other UN agencies and partners on the ground. Because, you know, as peacekeepers are in many of these contexts, the first responders, right? They might come across children who have been recruited or raped or so on, and they need to know what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not to put too much emphasis on it, but peacekeepers have in the past also not just been first responders, but perpetrators of some of these rights violations. Do you train them in that sense as well, like about where the line is in terms of their interaction with civilian populations and
Yes,
what the international law says about it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a critical component of our trainings on sexual exploitation and abuse and the UN standards of conduct on that. You know, there is zero tolerance, right? There's the zero tolerance policy, but we still see it happening, not just by the military peacekeepers, but civilians as well, and members of the humanitarian community, which is really reprehensible in my opinion, because you're there to protect the communities and not be the perpetrator. So yes, there is that, certainly.
Yeah. We've had some background noise and your son sort of ducking into camera. So if I may, I wanted to ask a little bit about how you're juggling motherhood and this amazing global career that you're having. Are there sacrifices that you feel like you had to make to pursue one or the other, or now as you try and balance the two?
I would say yes. And, you know, not to take away from the fact, you know, that I love being his mom, but there are sacrifices, obviously, and you make those choices, right? These are I've thought through them, and I've decided, to slightly change paths. So for the time being, I'm back in Malaysia. So no plans to sort of undertake missions to conflict zones or anything like that. But I still try to work on these issues, and I found that by training these military who are ultimately being deployed as peacekeepers, training them on child protection, training them on conflict-related sexual violence, allows me to continue to do the work that I love, right? And that I find important. So it's not, in that sense, it's not really a sacrifice, right? But it's sort of finding another, an alternative, not path, I can't find the word, but something that also continues to give you that joy and allows you to pursue your passion in terms of your career goals, and while being at home.
And so now that I've pried into the personal life a little bit, let me ask you one follow-up. What happens when your son asks you about your work? Do you talk to him, or have you thought about when he's perhaps a little bit older? How it's something that I struggle with, war and peace and rights violations. These are very heavy, sad, depressing topics. I was just wondering how you sort of broached this aspect of parenting.
I haven't, right? I haven't. I think he's still too small. When I do the trainings, sometimes I've had to, I've had to travel to like places like Bangladesh or Indonesia and so on. And so he sort of understands that mommy's leaving for work, but he doesn't understand the nature of the work yet. But you know what I've started, Johnny, is I've started creating albums of my times in the different countries, because precisely for the reasons you mentioned, really, so that later when he's slightly old enough, I can show him the photos of where I've been and what I've done, and then if he has questions, then you can sort of answer that, right, and then tackle it from that.
That's beautiful.
Point,
and he's going to be very proud of his mummy, let me tell you, as we all are. I'm conscious of time. I am curious. I do have a few wrap-up questions as well, but what do you see sort of sitting back? I want you to sort of look to the future, I guess. In particular, I have two questions. One, a very practical one. What are you doing this week? What's your next project that you're working on that you can share with us? But then also, what's the future of, international law in this realm of civilian protection? Do you have hope for the future?
So your first question, yes. So I finally got some work. COVID has affected our livelihoods, fortunately. But I will be actually undertaking a consultancy with UNICEF here on prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. So UNICEF globally, this is part of their commitment and investment on trying to put in measures, right, to prevent SCA and mitigate risks across the development sector. So we are training all UNICEF partners on strengthening their own organizational capacities regarding prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. Sort of that in a nutshell. They all have to go through a risk assessment process. And if they are, if they don't have the necessary policies in place or training programs in place, for example, or referral mechanisms in place, should they come across victims of SEA, then they may be rated as medium to high risk, and then we have then we're supporting them to develop all these develop an action plan and put in place all these measures so that they can reduce their risk, but most importantly be able to prevent and address SEA within their own sort of communities that they are serving, right?
Yeah.
The beneficiaries that they are serving. Yeah.
Sounds great.
So that, yeah, it's a short term.
And the future, when you look over the horizon, are you hopeful? Are you, what's the future of, civilian protection or child protection in armed conflict? And, or if that's, I mean, ponder that, but what do we need to do more in international law to protect civilians in armed conflict? How about that?
I think there needs to be, well, two things. I think, I think there needs to be more accountability, right, for these crimes. Recently, I mean, last year, 2019, we saw the International Criminal Court, for instance, finding this infamous rebel commando, Bosco Ntaganda. I don't know if you know him or if you've heard of him.
Not personally.
Found him guilty. Found him guilty for crimes against humanity, for war crimes. But for the first time, they found him guilty for the crimes committed by the troops under his command. Right, and I think that sets an important precedence, and that needs to happen a lot more. And it's also for the first time, I think we see a case where there was a guilty verdict for the crimes of sexual slavery. And these are crimes that, they have happened historically in conflicts, but we're just seeing a lot of that happening, in many of the contemporary conflicts. Right. And so I think ending impunity should be, that we should focus our efforts on that. And I think then there's the prevention aspect, right? So I think we're very good at responding as an international community, be it the UN or civil society organizations or even national authorities. But we haven't sat back to think of how do we prevent these from happening in the first place, right? How do we strengthen the capacities of the government to be able to address these concerns, right? Whether it's the security sector, whether it's their rule of law, and so on and so forth. Like, I know there's a lot of research actually ongoing right now on how do we prevent recruitment and use of children, for instance, right? So we do all these DDR programs, right? But that's responding, right? And we understand sort of the structural concerns around poverty and lack of education and youth bulge and so on. So in all these factors that may drive children into the arms of armed groups. But then children also have a sense of resilience, right? And a lot of children who grow up in the same context don't join armed groups. So why is that? And we need to explore that a lot more. Right. And what are some of the warning signs? What are some of the early warning indicators that would signal to us that children might be recruited or children might be driven into armed groups, or what are the push and pull factors, right? Beyond those big socioeconomic issues, and then how do we address those? So
it's it's a great work agenda for us all. Fantastic. Shree, so let me end with some more light questions. Heroes that have come before you, Who do you draw inspiration from?
I think a couple of people. When I joined the UN in New York, I was inspired by the special representative of the Secretary General then, Mr. Olara Otunu from Uganda. And that kind of cemented my desire to, to continue on this path, right? Working on the protection of children in armed conflict. He has his flaws, but he was really an inspiring individual. That was when I started off. But then when I was already doing the work, really drew my inspiration from the children, really. I mean, I don't know whether it's a cliche to say that, or very cheesy to say that, but it's true. I mean, I was in Somalia, and I met the father of two little girls who were raped, right? And really joyful, fun little girls, but who at that very young age had already undergone a traumatic experience that no child should. But that's the reality for thousands and thousands of children and civilians in these conflict communities. And that affected me. That particular meeting affected me very deeply, and I continue to think about them. They are probably grown women by now, but still, I think about them, and and that drives me, I guess. So
Beautiful.
they are my little heroes or
Beautiful.
sheroes.
Sheroes. Best book you've read on international law?
Ooh. That's a tough question.
Or that impacts your work, in civilian protection. Best book? Fiction, non-fiction?
Oh my goodness. I have to say that I haven't been reading very much in the past few years.
We've heard the reason why. It's all good.
But if I would recommend, I would definitely recommend reading the books by Ismail Bea. I think Ismail has a new book. A new book meaning it was published maybe 2-3 years ago, which I bought, but I haven't started on it.
Yes, I do the same.
Yeah. And for your listeners, Ismail was a former child soldier from Liberia, but now a strong advocate on protection of children in conflict.
Yeah. Fantastic. And best movie you've seen related to your work? Or that best movie on international law that everyone should go out and watch?
Oh, nothing comes to mind, Johnny, right now.
It's all good, all good. How about this? What's your favorite international law moment in history?
International law moment. Oh,
yeah.
I'll tell you this.
You okay?
I think. Well, I'll narrate the story, and you tell me if it sort of, answers your question. It was actually my meetings with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, who have been denying that they had children associated with their group for the longest time, despite having signed the agreement. When I sat down to meet with them initially, it was always, no, children were drawn to it because of the circumstances the conflict, and we did not have a policy, well and good. But the fact was, they kept saying, we didn't have children associated with us, and then there was that light bulb moment when the person I was negotiating with, or the person who led the panel on the MILF side, looked at me and he said, okay, we don't deny, right? We recruited and used children. We don't have a policy, but we recruited and used children. And when the leadership said, but where were the children? The children are too small. They're not able to carry these heavy weapons, So what do you mean we recruited and used children? And then this MILF person who represented the leadership turned around and said, but the children were the ones who pulled the horses who were carrying the weapons. So they are our child soldiers. So I think for me, that was a turning point, really. And that really then, slowly, 3 years later, right, we managed to get all the 1,800 something children.
Amazing. Amazing. I'm almost done. I can tell you have priorities. Jeyashree, do you have any advice to students of international law that are listening to this now? What would you have liked to have heard when you were way back in a uni student? What advice would you give for someone that wants a career in international law?
I think I would say go for it, and take it to the next realm if you can. It's an important qualification to have, and I think it will take you far. And I think with that degree, you can really genuinely and directly impact lives on the ground. You can also make a lot of money if you want from it, but I would certainly recommend, honestly, in hindsight, right? If I had somebody who gave me advice when I was in my early 20s, I wish I had someone who showed me the path to the law or to political science even. There was nobody to guide me, and so for all those young people who now are at that cusp of making an important decision on the path that they want to take, please, international law is a good path to take, but also keep in mind the people on the ground who are living in these difficult contexts. And if you can apply what you learn to making their lives better, why not, right?
Why not? Shree, my final question, it's a fill in the blank. It's a really easy one. International law is fill in the blank.
International law is the easiest questions are always the hardest to answer, isn't it? International law is important to ending impunity for crimes against women and children.
Fantastic. Shree, there endeth the interview. I can't help but say that when I was prepping for this interview, I also was reading a little bit about the life and times of John Lewis, who was a civil rights icon in the United States, and someone I have had the good fortune of sort of mixing with in the flesh when I used to work in Washington. And there was a quote of his that I just thought, well, I read the quote and then I instantly thought of you as, you know, the embodiment of it. So I just wanted to sort of read the quote and end on this, if you don't mind. John Lewis, a US civil rights icon, said, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble."
Yes.
And I feel
That's
like
perfect.
you've gotten into some necessary trouble over your career, and the world is a better place for it. So, Jeyashree Nadarajah, thank you for making the world a better place.
Thank you, Johnny, for this opportunity. Really, truly humbled by your words, and you know, just remember, I'm a small fish in this huge ocean, and all of you, you know, have a role to play, and you are all playing an important role. You know, it's a collective effort, isn't it?
Indeed. All right. Well, thank you very much for tuning in. And thank you, Jeyashree, for joining us. I don't know about you, Jeyashree, but I'm going to go and give my boys a big hug now.
Me too. Sounds
All
like
right.
a plan.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Johnny.